The ice axe slipped from Marcus Wellington's trembling fingers, clattering against the granite face as his designer climbing gloves, $1,500 at the Seattle REI flagship, proved utterly useless against the terror pumping through his veins. The brown bear, massive and impossibly high on the mountain, stood on its hind legs not 20 feet away, its hot breath visible in the thin air at 13,000 feet. Marcus pressed his back against the rock wall, his $8,000 Arc'teryx expedition suit doing nothing to stop the cold sweat soaking through every layer. This wasn't supposed to happen. Bears didn't come this high. His guide had said so, but what this arrogant bully didn't know was that he'd been following the wrong person up this mountain. That his weeks of harassment and threats had led him to ignore every warning, every sign that screamed danger. And now, the wilderness he'd treated like his personal playground was showing him what real power looked like. Subscribe now to witness how nature delivers the ultimate justice when human arrogance meets ancient consequence. But let's rewind to where it all began, 3 months earlier in the small town of Talkeetna, Alaska, where the spring thaw was just beginning to reveal what winter had hidden. Tommy Naknek wiped down the counter at the base camp lodge for the 3rd time that morning, his movements practiced and efficient, despite the exhaustion pulling at his shoulders. He'd been up since 4, helping his grandmother prepare salmon for drying, then rushed to open the lodge by 6 for the early climbers, checking weather reports over bitter coffee. At 28, Tommy had the kind of lean, weathered look that came from growing up in the shadow of Denali, his dark eyes carrying the weight of someone who'd seen too many tourists treat his home like an amusement park. His flannel shirt was worn soft from years of use, patched at the elbows by his grandmother's careful hands, and his boots had been resoled twice, because new ones cost more than he made in a month. The lodge wasn't much, a combination coffee shop, gear rental, and local gathering place, but it had been in his family since his great-grandfather built it in 1947, and Tommy treated every beam and floorboard with respect. The bell above the door chimed, and Tommy looked up to see Elena Rodriguez pushing through with a blast of cold morning air. She stomped snow from her boots and pulled off her knit cap, her graying hair escaping in wisps around her brown face. Elena had been guiding climbers on Denali for 30 years, one of the first Latina women to summit back in the early 90s, and she taught Tommy everything he knew about the mountain. She'd also been there the night Tommy's father didn't come home from a rescue mission 7 years ago, had held Tommy's mother as she wept, had helped carry the financial burden when the funeral costs nearly destroyed them. "Coffee smells good, mijo," Elena said, settling onto her usual stool at the counter. "But you look like hell. Grandmother keeping you up late with stories again?" Tommy smiled despite his exhaustion and poured her a cup without asking how she took it, black with 1 sugar, same as every morning for 3 years. "Helping with the fish. Season's starting early this year." "Everything's starting early," Elena muttered, wrapping her weathered hands around the mug. "Ice is melting faster up high. Bear activity's weird. I found tracks at 7,500 feet last week. That's not normal." Before Tommy could respond, the bell chimed again, and the atmosphere in the lodge shifted like a cold front moving in. Marcus Wellington strode through the door, as if he owned not just the building, but the entire town. His expedition team trailing behind like courtiers following a king. Tommy had seen hundreds of climbers come through Talkeetna, but Marcus was a particular type, the kind who wore his wealth like armor and treated everyone around him like servants. His gear was pristine, tags still visible on some pieces, and his 3 companions wore matching custom jackets with Wellington Denali Expedition 2012 embroidered across the backs. Finally, civilization, Marcus announced to no one in particular, his voice carrying the entitled boom of someone used to being heard. He was tall, probably 40, with the kind of artificial tan that came from luxury spas, and the confidence that came from never being told no. Though, I use the term loosely, is there anywhere in this town that serves real coffee? Tommy felt Elena tense beside him, but he kept his expression neutral, the way his grandmother had taught him. "What can I get you?" he asked evenly. Marcus barely glanced at him, already studying the photos on the wall, images of successful summit teams, including one of Tommy's father from 2003. 4 lattes, oat milk. "Not that disgusting regular milk, and make them actually hot this time," Yesterday's were lukewarm. We don't have oat milk, Tommy said. Regular or soy? Of course you don't. Marcus sighed dramatically, turning to his team with an exaggerated eye roll. See what I mean? Backwards. Chad, remind me why we didn't just fly straight to base camp and skip this tourist trap? The man Marcus had called Chad, tall, blonde, wearing sunglasses despite the early hour, shrugged. Regulations, boss. Have to check in with the park service. Bureaucratic nonsense, Marcus muttered. He finally looked directly at Tommy, his gaze dismissive in a way that made Tommy feel like furniture. Fine, regular lattes then, and I need a guide, someone who actually knows the mountain, not one of these weekend warriors. Elena set down her cup with deliberate care. Tommy's one of the best guides in Alaska. Licensed, experienced, knows Denali better than most people know their own backyard. Marcus's laugh was sharp and ugly. Him? He looks like he should be parking cars, not climbing mountains. I need someone qualified. The insult landed exactly as Marcus intended, and Tommy felt heat rise in his cheeks, but he kept his hand steady as he started the espresso machine. His father had taught him that dignity meant not rising to every provocation, that some people's opinions weren't worth the energy it took to correct them. Elena Rodriguez is available, Tommy said quietly. 30 years experience, multiple summit records, mountain rescue certified. Her? Marcus looked Elena up and down like she was livestock. How old are you, sweetheart? 60? I'm not trusting my life to a grandmother. I'm 52, Elena said, her voice dangerously calm, and I've pulled more entitled idiots off that mountain than you've had hot meals. But you're right, you shouldn't hire me. I don't guide people I can't stand. Marcus's face darkened. Do you know who I am? I own Wellington Capital Management. I've climbed Kilimanjaro, Aconcagua, and Elbrus. I don't need some washed-up has been telling me what I can and cannot do. Those are walking mountains, Elena said. Denali is different. The weather alone kills people who don't respect it. I'll take my chances, Marcus said, turning back to Tommy. I'll pay you $5,000 to guide us. That's probably more than you make in 6 months at this dump. Tommy finished the lattes, sliding them across the counter. I'm not available. Try Alaska Mountain Guides in Anchorage. Not available? Marcus's voice rose. I just offered you $5,000, and I said no. Tommy met Marcus's eyes steadily. The lodge doesn't close itself. My grandmother needs help with the season prep, and honestly, I don't think we'd work well together. What Tommy didn't say, what he'd learned from years of dealing with men like Marcus, was that turning down money he desperately needed was sometimes the only way to maintain his self-respect. His family had lived in Alaska for generations, had learned to read the land's moods, had developed an understanding of the mountain that went deeper than technical skill. Men like Marcus looked at Denali and saw a trophy, another peak to add to their collection, another story to tell at cocktail parties. Tommy looked at Denali and saw home, saw danger, saw something that demanded humility. Marcus's jaw tightened. You're making a mistake, boy, a big one. Maybe, Tommy said, but it's my mistake to make. The rest of the week passed in escalating tension. Marcus Wellington made it his personal mission to let everyone in Talkeetna know what he thought of Tommy Naknek and his primitive backwoods operation. He held court at the Fairview Inn each evening, buying rounds for other climbers while loudly questioning Tommy's qualifications, his intelligence, even his heritage. These locals, Marcus would say, voice carrying across the bar. They think they own the mountain just because they were born here, but expertise comes from money and education, not from some romantic notion of indigenous wisdom. Tommy heard the stories from other guides, from the park rangers who stopped by for coffee, from climbers who apologized quietly while picking up their gear. He said nothing, just kept his head down and did his work, but Elena noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his smile had become forced. You should report him, she said one evening after closing, helping Tommy stack chairs. That's harassment. The Park Service takes that seriously. Report him for what? Being an asshole? Tommy shook his head. Guys like that, they have lawyers, they have connections. My family's had enough trouble without inviting more. Your father would want you to stand up for yourself. My father stood up for himself, and it got him killed, trying to rescue someone who shouldn't have been up there in the first place." Tommy's voice was harder than he intended. "I'm not like him. I'm practical." But Marcus Wellington wasn't content with words. The harassment escalated in small, calculated ways. He hired away Tommy's part-time helper with an offer of triple wages. He left a 1-star review on every travel website he could find, claiming the base camp lodge served contaminated food and that Tommy had been drunk on duty. He filed a complaint with the Park Service, alleging that Tommy's guiding license was fraudulent, forcing Tommy to spend a day in Anchorage providing documentation and sitting through interviews. The complaint was dismissed quickly. Tommy's credentials were impeccable, but it cost him time and money he couldn't afford. His grandmother noticed the stress, the way he'd stopped sleeping properly, the darkness gathering under his eyes. She was 83, still strong despite her years, and she'd survived more hardship than Marcus Wellington could imagine. One night, she made Tommy sit at her kitchen table while she prepared tea the traditional way, using herbs she'd gathered herself. "That man is broken inside," she said in Dena'ina, their ancestral language. "Broken people break others to feel whole. But you are not broken. You come from a line of people who survived winter, who learned to live with the land instead of against it. His money means nothing to the mountain. His money means everything here," Tommy replied in English, too tired to make the language switch. "He's staying at the nicest hotel, eating at the restaurants, spreading lies. People are starting to believe him. Then let the mountain teach him what money cannot buy," his grandmother said. "Wisdom, respect, humility. These things come from listening to what is bigger than yourself." Tommy wanted to believe her, but the next morning brought new problems. Someone had spray-painted fraud across the front window of the lodge. The security camera Tommy had installed after the last incident showed 3 figures in matching expedition jackets, faces obscured, laughing as they vandalized his family's business. He recognized Marcus Wellington's distinctive gait, the way he walked with his shoulders back and chest out like he was perpetually posing for a photograph. Tommy called the police, but Chief Harper, who spent every summer guiding wealthy tourists on fishing expeditions, barely looked at the footage. "Can't really see their faces," Harper said, his tone suggesting he didn't particularly care to look harder. "Could be anyone, boys being boys. You got insurance?" "Boys being boys?" Tommy repeated, anger finally breaking through his careful control. "They vandalized my business. That's a crime. File a report if you want," Harper shrugged. "But between you and me, maybe if you'd been more accommodating to your customers, they wouldn't have gotten upset. Marcus Wellington's brought a lot of money to this town. His team's spending thousands at local businesses. You think people are going to take your side over his?" The message was clear. Tommy wasn't just fighting Marcus Wellington. He was fighting a system that had always valued money over justice, that saw Tommy's native heritage as something quaint at best and inferior at worst. He filed the report anyway, knowing it would go nowhere, and spent his own money replacing the window. Elena helped him clean up the glass, her face tight with fury. "This is escalating, Tommy. That pendejo is dangerous." "I know," Tommy said quietly. "But what am I supposed to do? He's leaving in 3 days for his climb. Then he'll be gone, and life goes back to normal." "Will it?" Elena asked. "Because from where I'm standing, he's declared war on you. And men like that don't stop until they win, or until someone makes them stop." She was right, but Tommy didn't know what making Marcus stop would look like. That afternoon, he focused on what he could control, checking supplies for his own upcoming guide jobs, reviewing weather patterns, maintaining his equipment with the careful attention his father had taught him. Climbing gear was expensive, so Tommy treated every piece like it might save his life someday, because it might. His ropes were perfectly coiled, his carabiners inspected for stress fractures, his crampons sharpened and oiled against rust. He was reorganizing his gear closet when Marcus Wellington walked into the lodge without knocking, flanked by Chad and another team member. Tommy straightened slowly, noting that the other customers, a nice couple from Oregon, suddenly found reasons to leave. "We have a problem," Marcus announced, tossing a manila envelope onto the counter. I've been asking around about you. Seems your father died in a climbing accident, lost his nerve, froze up, got his whole team killed. The lie hit Tommy like a physical blow. His father had died a hero, sacrificing himself to secure a rope that saved 3 other climbers during an unexpected storm. The Park Service had awarded him a posthumous medal for valor, but Tommy also knew that correcting Marcus would be pointless. Men like him didn't care about truth. My father's death has nothing to do with my qualifications, Tommy said, his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest. Doesn't it, though? Marcus smiled, and it was the cruelest expression Tommy had ever seen. See, I'm wondering if maybe climbing incompetence runs in families. Maybe that's why you're stuck running this pathetic coffee shop instead of doing real guiding work. Maybe you're scared. Maybe you know you're not good enough. Get out, Tommy said quietly. Make me, Marcus challenged. Go ahead. Put your hands on me. I've got witnesses. My lawyers would own this shack and everything your family has before the week's out. It was a trap, obvious and crude, but effective. Tommy's hands clenched into fists at his sides, but he didn't move. He thought about his grandmother, about the lodge, about everything his family had built. He thought about his father's voice. The mountain doesn't care about your anger, son. It only cares about your judgment. I won't touch you, Tommy said, but I'm asking you to leave my business. Marcus laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Your business? Right. Well, I've got news for you. I bought the building next door. The old gear shop closed last month, and I snapped it up for cash. I'm going to turn it into a real outfitter. Professional, clean, modern. By this time next year, nobody will remember this dump existed. He wasn't bluffing. Tommy had seen the sold sign go up on the old Northern Lights Outfitters storefront, but he'd assumed some local buyer. The thought of Marcus Wellington owning property in Talkeetna, of him becoming a permanent fixture, made Tommy's stomach turn. Why? Tommy asked. Why are you doing this? I turned down one guiding job, that's all. Why does that make you so angry? For just a moment, something flickered across Marcus's face. Something raw and hurt beneath the arrogance, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by contempt. Because people like you need to learn their place. You're small, you're insignificant, and I'm going to prove it. After they left, Tommy sat in the empty lodge and let himself shake. He wasn't a violent person, had never been in a real fight, but he'd come close to throwing away everything for the satisfaction of wiping that smirk off Marcus Wellington's face. Instead, he called Elena. She arrived 20 minutes later with James Redfeather, a Vietnam veteran who ran a small air charter service and had been friends with Tommy's father. James was 70, built like a weathered tree trunk, with scars on his hands from frostbite and war. He listened to Tommy's story without interruption, his weathered face unreadable. This man is a bully, James said finally. I've known 1,000 of them. He's not angry at you specifically. He's angry at the world, at something inside himself he can't fix. You're just convenient. That doesn't help me, Tommy said. No, James agreed, but it tells you something important. Bullies are predictable. They escalate until someone stops them, or until they destroy themselves. This Marcus, he's going up Denali. Day after tomorrow, he hired a guide from Anchorage. Some kid who just got certified, probably doesn't know the mountain well. Then the mountain will teach him, James said, echoing Tommy's grandmother. And maybe that's justice enough. But justice wasn't coming fast enough for Marcus Wellington. That night, someone broke into the lodge through the back window, the one Tommy had forgotten to secure properly, while distracted by the day's events. They didn't steal anything valuable. Instead, they destroyed things that mattered. His father's summit photos were ripped from the walls and torn to pieces. His grandmother's traditional beadwork, which decorated the lodge's interior, was pulled down and trampled. Most devastating, they found the wooden box where Tommy kept his father's climbing journal, the detailed weather notes and route descriptions that represented 30 years of accumulated wisdom, and scattered the pages across the floor, many of them torn or missing. Tommy found the destruction at dawn when he came to open up. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, unable to process the malice required to do this. Then he saw the note spray-painted across the back wall. Savages belong in the wilderness, not in business. This time, even Chief Harper couldn't completely dismiss it. The racial slur was too blatant, too documented. But his response was carefully calculated. "I'll investigate," he promised, photographing the damage with obvious reluctance. "But you have to understand, Mr. Naknek, that without witnesses or clear evidence, it's hard to pursue charges. Mr. Wellington has already left for his climb. He and his team departed this morning, so they have alibis." "He could have hired someone," Tommy said. "Could have," Harper agreed. "But that's speculation. Look, I'll file a report. Maybe your insurance will cover it. But stirring up trouble with a man like Marcus Wellington, that's not going to end well for you." The message was clear. Tommy was on his own. He spent the rest of the day cleaning up, trying to salvage what he could of his father's journal pages. Elena and James came to help, along with other locals who'd heard about the destruction. Quiet support from people who knew Marcus Wellington was poison, but feared his influence too much to speak openly. Sarah Chen from the bakery brought food. Mike Peterson from the hardware store brought supplies to fix the window. Even some of the younger guides stopped by, kids Tommy had mentored over the years, offering labor and solidarity. It wasn't enough to undo the damage, but it reminded Tommy that he wasn't as alone as Marcus wanted him to feel. "What are you going to do?" Elena asked as they rehung what photos could be salvaged. "I don't know," Tommy admitted. "He's on the mountain now. Maybe James is right. Maybe that's enough." But it wasn't enough, because Marcus Wellington had made one final move before leaving for his climb. Tommy discovered it that afternoon when a courier arrived with legal paperwork. Marcus was suing him for defamation, claiming that Tommy had spread false rumors about Marcus's climbing abilities and had attempted to sabotage his expedition. The lawsuit was frivolous, would likely be dismissed, but it would cost Tommy thousands in legal fees he didn't have. Attached to the lawsuit was a handwritten note: "See you when I get back, if you're still here." That night, Tommy sat with his grandmother and told her everything. She listened in the way of her generation, letting silence hold space for grief and anger. When he finished, she got up slowly and retrieved a bundle from her bedroom, something wrapped in caribou hide that Tommy had never seen before. "Your great-great-grandfather carried this," she said, unwrapping it carefully. Inside was a knife, the blade worn but perfectly maintained, the handle carved with symbols Tommy recognized from stories. He carried it when he crossed the ice to follow the caribou. "Your father carried it on his first summit, and now you will carry it." "Grandmother, I'm not going anywhere." "No." She looked at him with eyes that had seen too much of the world's cruelty. "That man is trying to break you, trying to break our family. Your father would not have stood for it." "Father's dead," Tommy said, and immediately regretted the harshness. "He died protecting others," his grandmother corrected gently. "He died with honor, but he would not have let someone destroy what we built. Sometimes, Tommy, you must go into the cold to survive it." He didn't understand what she meant until the next morning, when James Redfeather appeared at the lodge before dawn. "Get your gear," James said without preamble. "We're going up." "Up where?" "The mountain. Marcus Wellington and his team are making mistakes. I've been listening to the radio chatter. They're moving too fast, ignoring weather warnings, and their guide is too inexperienced to stand up to Wellington's ego. Someone needs to be up there to pull them out when it goes bad." "That's not my responsibility," Tommy said, but his hands were already moving toward his equipment closet. "No," James agreed, "but it's your mountain. And like it or not, when rich assholes get themselves killed up there, it reflects on all of us. Plus," he added with a grim smile, "I figured you might want to see justice done in person." They flew out within the hour, James's small plane banking low over the Alaska Range, as the sun painted Denali's flanks in shades of gold and crimson. Tommy watched the mountain grow larger, felt the familiar mixture of awe and respect that had been bred into him across generations. The mountain was beautiful and lethal, impartial in its judgment. It didn't care about money or race or past grievances. It only cared about skill, preparation, and respect. "You know what I think?" James said over the headset. "I think that bastard has been following you your whole life, metaphorically speaking, following your success, your connection to this place, everything he can't buy. And now he's literally following you up the mountain, trying to prove he's better, but the mountain keeps its own score." They landed at base camp, and Tommy immediately felt the wrongness in the air. It was too warm for this elevation, the snow too soft, the clouds gathering in patterns that spoke of a storm front moving in faster than forecasted. Other teams were hunkering down, setting up their camps with the careful attention of people who understood they were guests in a hostile environment. Tommy found Marcus Wellington's camp by following the noise. While other teams maintained quiet discipline, Marcus's group had set up a portable speaker system, blasting rock music across the glacier. They'd brought wine in insulated bottles, expensive steaks for dinner, and enough gear to outfit a small army. Their guide, a kid who couldn't have been more than 25, looked overwhelmed and exhausted. "Tommy Knack-Knack," Marcus said when he spotted them approaching. "What a surprise. Couldn't stand to let me enjoy my moment of glory." "Storm coming," Tommy said, keeping his voice neutral. "Big one. You should delay your summit push." "Should I?" Marcus smiled. "Or are you just trying to sabotage me? See, I checked with the park service. They say the weather window is perfect for the next 48 hours. "The Park Service gets their data from instruments," James interjected. "Tommy gets his from living here. There's a difference." "Oh, please." Marcus turned to his team, playing to an audience. "The old native wisdom card. What's next? Are you going to do a rain dance? Read the flight patterns of birds?" "The birds are wrong," Tommy said quietly, and he was right. The ravens were flying lower than they should, seeking shelter in the rocks. The wind had that particular bite that came before pressure drops. Even the texture of the snow under his boots felt different. "I'm telling you this, as one climber to another. Wait 24 hours. Let the system pass." Marcus's guide cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. Wellington, maybe we should do what I'm paying you to do," Marcus snapped. "Which is guide, not gossip. We summit tomorrow morning, weather or no weather. I've got investors expecting photos, a magazine interview scheduled, sponsors to satisfy. I'm not delaying because some coffee shop owner has a hunch." Tommy looked at the young guide, saw the fear and the resignation in his eyes. The kid knew Marcus was wrong, but couldn't afford to stand up to him. Tommy understood that position too well. "Your choice," Tommy said, "but we'll be on the mountain. When you need help, and you will, trigger your emergency beacon. We'll come." "I won't need help from you," Marcus said, and there was real hatred in his voice now. "In fact, I want you off this mountain. You're not authorized to be here." "I'm a licensed guide with a permit for a private expedition," James said calmly. "We're here legally. You want to try and remove us, call the Park Service. But I suspect they'll tell you what I'm telling you. The mountain belongs to everyone and no one." They set up their own camp a quarter-mile away, far enough for safety, but close enough to respond if needed. That night, Tommy lay in his tent listening to the wind pick up, watching the stars disappear behind clouds that moved too fast. He thought about his father, about all the stories of climbers who'd ignored warnings and paid with their lives. He thought about Marcus Wellington and the peculiar kind of arrogance that confused money with competence. "You really think he'll need rescue?" James asked from the other sleeping bag. "I think he's already made 3 fatal mistakes," Tommy said. "He didn't acclimatize properly. He's carrying too much unnecessary weight, and he doesn't respect what he's climbing." "4th mistake," James added. "He made an enemy of the one person who could have taught him how to survive up here." They woke before dawn to the sound of Marcus Wellington's team beginning their summit push. Through binoculars, Tommy watched them move up the glacier, their headlamps bobbing in the darkness. They were moving too fast, burning energy they'd need later, and they were roped too far apart for safety. The young guide was trying to maintain proper protocol, but Marcus kept pushing ahead, impatient and aggressive. "Should we follow?" James asked. "Not yet," Tommy said, though every instinct screamed to do something. "We just make him more reckless. He needs to learn this lesson himself." But by mid-morning, the lesson was arriving faster than Tommy had anticipated. The storm front hit with the fury of something that had been building for days. Wind speeds jumped from 15 to 60 miles per hour in less than 20 minutes. Visibility dropped to near zero. The temperature, which had been borderline survivable, plummeted into the realm, where exposed skin froze in seconds. Tommy and James had their camp secured and were riding out the worst of it when the radio crackled to life. "Mayday, Mayday. This is Wellington Expedition. We need immediate assistance. Multiple team members down. Repeat, multiple team members down." The voice was the young guide's, high with panic and probably hypothermia. Tommy grabbed the radio. "This is Knack-Knack. What's your position?" "Approximately 13,000 feet, West Ridge." Mr. Wellington insisted on continuing despite conditions. We have 1 unconscious, 2 severely hypothermic, and visibility is 0. I've lost track of Mr. Wellington. He was ahead of us and wouldn't stop when I called. You have shelter? Snow cave. Barely. It's not going to hold if the wind gets worse. Tommy looked at James, saw his own grim determination reflected there. We're coming to you. Stay on the radio. Keep talking to me. What followed was 6 hours of the most brutal climbing Tommy had ever experienced. The storm wanted them dead, pure and simple. It threw everything it had at them, wind that threatened to tear them off the mountain, cold that found every gap in their clothing, snow that erased the world beyond arm's length. But Tommy had grown up in this environment, had learned to read terrain by touch when vision failed, had developed the kind of intuition that came from generations of ancestors who'd survived in harsh conditions. They found the guide and 2 team members huddled in an inadequate snow cave, the third unconscious from exposure, but still breathing. Tommy and James got emergency bivy sacks around everyone, force-fed them warm liquids from thermoses, made the hard decision to wait out the worst of the storm before attempting descent. "Where's Marcus?" Tommy asked the guide. "He kept going," the kid said through chattering teeth. "Said he could see the summit, said we were cowards for stopping. I tried to tell him." "You did your best," Tommy said. "Not your fault he wouldn't listen." But as he said it, Tommy felt the weight of responsibility settling onto his shoulders. Marcus Wellington was still up there somewhere, alone in a storm. And despite everything the man had done, Tommy couldn't just leave him to die. That wasn't who Tommy was, wasn't who his father had raised him to be. "I'm going after him," Tommy told James. "That's suicide," James said flatly. "You'll die up there. Maybe, but I'll know I tried." James was quiet for a long moment. "Your father would do the same stupid thing. That's how I know you're his son." Tommy left most of his gear with James and pushed higher into the storm, following the faint traces of Marcus's passage, where the wind hadn't completely erased them. The mountain fought him at every step, but Tommy pressed on with a kind of stubborn determination that had nothing to do with saving Marcus and everything to do with proving to himself that he was better than the hatred Marcus had tried to instill in him. He found Marcus Wellington at 13,300 feet, wedged against a rock outcrop, his expensive gear in disarray around him. But Marcus wasn't alone. Standing 15 feet away, perfectly adapted to the high altitude that should have been impossible, was a massive brown bear. The animal was a survivor, like Tommy, something that had learned to thrive where it shouldn't exist. It had been following Marcus's scent trail, drawn by the smell of the expensive energy bars and steaks he'd insisted on carrying despite the weight. Marcus saw Tommy and screamed something lost in the wind. The bear turned, acknowledged Tommy with the kind of assessment that predators use, then turned back to Marcus. It wasn't aggressive, not yet, just curious and hungry. But Marcus, in his panic and hypothermia-induced confusion, did the worst possible thing. He threw his ice axe at the bear. The axe missed, but the aggressive motion triggered the bear's defensive instincts. It charged, not to kill, but to neutralize a threat, but the result would be the same. Marcus scrambled backward, his crampons catching on his own rope, and he fell hard against the rock face. Tommy had seconds to make a decision. He could try to scare the bear off, could fire his emergency flare, could potentially save the man who'd spent weeks trying to destroy his life. Or he could let nature take its course, could let Marcus Wellington learn the final lesson about what happened when arrogance met consequence. What would you have done? This is the moment where character is revealed, where the difference between justice and revenge becomes clear. Subscribe now to see what happened next, because what Tommy chose would define everything that followed. Tommy pulled the emergency flare from his pack and fired it into the sky above the bear. The brilliant red light and sharp crack startled the animal, and it wheeled away from Marcus, disappearing into the storm with the kind of speed that seemed impossible for something so large. Tommy scrambled to Marcus, found him conscious but bleeding from a gash on his forehead where he'd hit the rock. "You came," Marcus said, his voice slurred with cold and shock. "Why?" "Because I'm not you," Tommy said simply, and began the work of getting Marcus stabilized for descent. The rescue took another 8 hours. By the time they got Marcus and his team down to base camp, Tommy had been awake for 36 hours and operating on nothing but stubbornness and caffeine. The storm had claimed Marcus's summit attempt, had nearly claimed Marcus's life and had absolutely demolished his ego. Park rangers airlifted Marcus and his team to Anchorage for treatment. The unconscious climber survived, but lost 3 toes to frostbite. 2 others had severe hypothermia, but recovered. Marcus himself suffered a concussion, frostbite on both hands, and the kind of psychological trauma that came from facing mortality in its rawest form. But here's what Marcus Wellington didn't know as the helicopter carried him away from Denali. His young guide had recorded everything, not intentionally, but because he'd activated his helmet camera at the start of the climb and had forgotten to turn it off. Hours of footage showing Marcus ignoring safety protocols, berating his team, pushing into dangerous conditions against expert advice, and finally abandoning his team to pursue glory alone. The guide, feeling guilty about the injuries his team had suffered and angry about Marcus's attempt to blame him for the disaster, turned the footage over to the Park Service. The investigation that followed was swift and thorough. The Park Service didn't take kindly to climbers who endangered themselves and required expensive rescue operations due to gross negligence. They revoked Marcus Wellington's climbing permits indefinitely. But the real justice came when the footage went viral. Someone, Tommy never found out who, though he suspected James, leaked the video to outdoor recreation websites. Within days, it had millions of views. The climbing community was small and tight-knit, and Marcus Wellington's name became synonymous with every climber's nightmare. The wealthy amateur who thought money could replace skill. The professional consequences were immediate. The sponsors who'd paid for Marcus's expedition dropped him. The magazine interview was canceled. His climbing club membership was revoked, but the personal consequences cut deeper. The footage showed, in stark detail, a man so consumed by ego that he'd rather die than admit he was wrong. It showed him abandoning his team, throwing his gear at a wild animal, screaming for help from the man he'd spent weeks trying to destroy. Tommy watched the video once, in the privacy of the lodge, and felt no satisfaction. He saw a broken person who'd never learned that strength came from admitting weakness, that real courage was asking for help. Marcus Wellington had been taught all his life that winning was everything, that other people were obstacles or tools, that enough money and force could overcome any challenge. The mountain had taught him different. The lawsuits Marcus had filed disappeared quietly. His lawyer called with mumbled apologies and settlement offers. The property Marcus had bought next to Tommy's lodge went on the market immediately. Marcus wanted nothing to remind him of Alaska. The harassment stopped, the rumors dried up, and Talkeetna slowly forgot that Marcus Wellington had ever existed. But Tommy didn't forget. He thought about that moment on the mountain, about the choice between vengeance and mercy. His father had died, saving people who'd made stupid decisions, had believed that every life had value, regardless of mistakes. Tommy had come close to violating that principle, had felt the seductive pull of letting nature handle his problem. The fact that he'd resisted, that he'd chosen to be better than his worst impulses, meant more than any public vindication. 6 weeks after the rescue, Tommy received a letter. The handwriting was shaky, probably from the nerve damage Marcus had sustained in his frostbitten hands. The letter was short. "You saved my life when you had every reason to let me die. I don't have the words to explain why I treated you the way I did. My therapist says I was projecting my own inadequacies. My ex-wife says I'm a narcissist. Maybe they're both right. I'm writing to tell you that I've started the process of making amends. I've donated $50,000 to the Alaska Native Heritage Center in your name. I've established a scholarship fund for Indigenous youth pursuing careers in outdoor recreation. It's not enough. It will never be enough, but it's a start. I also wanted you to know that the bear probably saved my life too, in a way. It forced me to confront what I'd become. I'm in therapy now. Real therapy, not just complaining to yes men. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that your choice to save me when I'd done everything possible to hurt you changed something in me. I hope one day to be the kind of person who would have made the same choice. Marcus Wellington." Tommy showed the letter to his grandmother. She read it slowly, then set it aside. "The mountain teaches everyone differently," she said. "Some it kills, some it humbles, a few it transforms. Perhaps this man learned what he needed to learn." "Do you think people can really change?" Tommy asked. "I think people change every day," his grandmother said. "Every choice is a chance to be different than you were. This man made bad choices for a long time. Now, he's trying to make better ones. Whether that lasts, who can say, but the trying matters. Tommy framed the letter and hung it in the lodge, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. It hung next to the restored photos of his father, next to his grandmother's beadwork, next to the climbing permits and certifications that represented his life's work. Underneath, he added a small plaque with a quote from his father's journal. "The mountain teaches what cannot be learned in comfort, strength, humility, and the value of those who stand beside you in the storm." The story could have ended there, with tidy resolution and moral closure, but life isn't that neat, and Tommy's story continued in ways both unexpected and profound. The publicity from Marcus Wellington's disaster brought attention to Tommy and the base camp lodge. Reporters called, wanting interviews about the rescue. Climbing magazines featured him in articles about indigenous guides and traditional mountain knowledge. Tourism increased as people wanted to meet the guide who'd saved a man who'd tried to ruin him. Tommy handled the attention with characteristic modesty, deflecting credit to James and the Park Service, but he also used the platform to talk about larger issues, about the way wealth insulated people from consequences, about the importance of respecting local knowledge, about the systemic racism that had dismissed him as unqualified, while celebrating Marcus Wellington's mediocrity. Some people didn't want to hear it. Tommy received hate mail from those who felt he was playing the victim, that Marcus's behavior had been normal competitive spirit, that Tommy should just be grateful for the publicity. But he also received messages from other guides, other indigenous people, other working class folks who'd experienced similar treatment and felt seen by his story. Elena helped him process it all, reminding him that visibility came with responsibility. "You're representing all of us now," she said. "Every indigenous guide, every person who's been told they're not good enough because of where they came from. That's a heavy weight." "I didn't ask for it," Tommy said. "No," Elena agreed. "But your father didn't ask to die saving others. We don't always get to choose our moments. We just get to choose how we show up for them." Tommy chose to show up by doing exactly what he'd always done, running the lodge, guiding carefully vetted clients, teaching young people the skills they needed to work safely in the mountains. But he also started offering free wilderness training to indigenous youth, partnering with schools and community centers to share the knowledge his family had accumulated across generations. One of his first students was Marcus Wellington's former guide, the kid who'd been in over his head and had paid for it with frostbite scars and trauma. His name was Danny Chen, and he'd nearly quit climbing entirely after the disaster. Tommy convinced him to give it another chance, spent months rebuilding his confidence and skills. "I froze up there," Danny confessed during a training session. "I knew we should turn back, but I couldn't make myself stand up to him. I felt like such a coward." "You weren't a coward," Tommy said. "You were young and inexperienced, and dealing with a man who'd spent his whole life bulldozing people who disagreed with him. That's not your fault. People died almost because I wasn't strong enough. People survived because you called for help when you realized you were in over your head. That takes more courage than most people ever show." Tommy paused, choosing his words carefully. "My father used to say that the mountain reveals who we really are. It strips away all the pretense and leaves only what's true. You want to know what was true about you up there? You prioritized your team's safety over your employer's ego. You stayed with the injured instead of running to save yourself. You called for rescue, even though you knew it would probably end your career. That's not cowardice, Danny. That's exactly the kind of guide I'd trust with my life." Danny worked with Tommy for 2 seasons, rebuilding his skills and his confidence. By the 3rd season, he was guiding independently again, but with a different philosophy, one that prioritized safety and communication over clients' egos or profit margins. Marcus Wellington, meanwhile, was slowly rebuilding his own life. Tommy heard updates through the climbing community's gossip network. Marcus had sold his company and entered intensive therapy. He'd started volunteering with at-risk youth in Seattle, using his climbing skills to teach confidence and teamwork. He'd reconciled with his ex-wife and children, relationships he'd neglected in pursuit of achievement. 2 years after the rescue, Marcus called the lodge. Tommy almost didn't answer when he saw the name on caller ID, but curiosity won out. "I'm planning to climb Kilimanjaro," Marcus said without preamble. "I know it's not Denali, but it's a start. I'm going with a proper guide, following all protocols, and I'm doing it to raise money for Native youth programs. I wanted to ask your permission before I proceed." "You don't need my permission," Tommy said. "Maybe not legally, but morally I do. You saved my life. That gives you a say in what I do with it." They talked for an hour, the longest conversation they'd ever had. Marcus didn't make excuses for his behavior, didn't try to minimize what he'd done. He simply acknowledged it, owned it, and explained what he was doing to become better. Tommy found himself believing him, not because words were trustworthy, but because actions over time told a story words couldn't fake. "Climb your mountain," Tommy finally said. "But Marcus, do it for the right reasons, not to prove anything to anyone else, just to prove something to yourself. What should I prove? That you can do hard things with humility, that you can succeed without diminishing others, that you've learned the difference between conquering and respecting." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Thank you, Tommy, for everything, especially for showing me what strength really looks like." After hanging up, Tommy sat in the lodge and thought about justice, about redemption, about whether people could truly change. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory. "Every choice is a chance to be different than you were." Maybe that was the real story, not about a bully getting his comeuppance, but about how mercy could be more powerful than vengeance, how teaching could be more valuable than punishing. The mountain had nearly killed Marcus Wellington, but Tommy's choice to save him had given Marcus the chance to become someone worth saving. The years that followed brought their own challenges and triumphs. The lodge thrived, becoming a model for indigenous-owned tourism businesses. Tommy trained a generation of guides who understood that expertise came from respect rather than dominance. He never got rich, never achieved the kind of wealth Marcus Wellington had possessed, but he built something more valuable, a legacy of integrity, a community of people who looked out for each other, a life lived according to principles that couldn't be bought or sold. And sometimes, late at night, when the lodge was quiet and the northern lights painted the sky in impossible colors, Tommy would think about that moment on the mountain. The moment when he could have walked away, could have let nature exact revenge for all the harassment and cruelty. He'd carry that choice with him forever, not as a burden, but as a compass. A reminder that the person he chose to be mattered more than what anyone else did to him. His father's journal, painstakingly reassembled from the torn pages Marcus's friends had destroyed, sat in a place of honor behind the counter. Tommy had added his own entries now, continuing the tradition of recording weather patterns and route conditions. But he'd also added something new, a section on encounters, both with wildlife and with human nature. The entry about Marcus Wellington was longer than most. "Today, I learned that saving someone's life doesn't make you their hero. It makes you their teacher, their mirror, their chance to choose differently." The mountain took everything Marcus Wellington thought made him special, his money, his confidence, his sense of superiority, and left him with only what was real. Some people would have died from that exposure. Marcus chose to grow from it. That choice, more than my choice to save him, is what created the possibility of redemption. Remember this: justice isn't just about consequences for wrongdoing. It's also about creating space for people to be better than their worst moments. The mountain is impartial, but we don't have to be. We can choose mercy without sacrificing accountability, can insist on change without demanding destruction. That's the lesson I'll carry forward, the one I'll teach to everyone who walks through these doors, seeking to test themselves against Denali. The mountain will humble you, will strip away pretense, will show you who you really are, but it's your choice what to do with that knowledge. Choose growth, choose accountability, choose to be better tomorrow than you were today. That's real strength, that's real courage. That's how we break the cycle of people like Marcus Wellington, creating pain because they've never learned a better way. Elena read the entry one evening and nodded approvingly. "Your father would be proud," she said. "Not just of the rescue, but of everything that came after. You didn't just save a man's life, you showed him how to live differently." "I don't know if I showed him anything," Tommy said. "He had to find it himself. But you gave him the chance. That's all any of us can do. Give people the chance to be better, then step back and let them decide." James Redfeather, older now but still flying, added his own perspective. "In the war, I saw men break and men rebuild themselves. The ones who made it weren't necessarily the strongest or the smartest. They were the ones who found reasons to be better than their circumstances. You gave Marcus Wellington that reason. Whether he stays changed, that's on him, but you did your part." The story of Tommy Naknek and Marcus Wellington became something of a legend in the Alaska climbing community. It was told around campfires at base camps, shared in climbing gyms from Seattle to Boston, used as a teaching example in wilderness leadership courses. But the story evolved in the telling, taking on mythic dimensions that both amused and frustrated Tommy. In some versions, the bear was enormous, a monster beast that only Tommy could face down. In others, Marcus Wellington's crimes were exaggerated into cartoonish villainy. In still others, Tommy became a superhuman rescuer who'd single-handedly carried 4 men down a mountain in a blizzard. The truth was simpler and more profound. A working-class guide had chosen mercy over revenge, and that choice had rippled outward in ways no one could have predicted. 5 years after the rescue, Tommy received an invitation to speak at an outdoor industry conference in Denver. He almost declined. Public speaking wasn't his strength, and he hated leaving the lodge, but Elena convinced him to go. "People need to hear your story," she said. "The real story, not the legend." The conference was overwhelming. Thousands of people, massive corporate booths, endless panels, and presentations. Tommy felt out of place in his worn flannel and practical boots, surrounded by people in technical fabrics and designer outdoor wear. But when he took the stage for his presentation, something shifted. He talked about the harassment he'd experienced, about systemic inequality in the outdoor industry, about the way expertise was valued differently depending on who possessed it. He talked about Marcus Wellington not as a villain, but as a symptom of a larger problem. A culture that rewarded dominance over collaboration, individual achievement over community knowledge, wealth over wisdom. And he talked about the choice he'd made on the mountain, about the tension between justice and mercy, about how saving Marcus's life had been the hardest and most important decision of his career. The audience was silent throughout, the kind of attention that felt almost sacred. When he finished, the applause was thunderous. But what mattered more were the conversations afterward, young guides of color thanking him for articulating their experiences, indigenous people expressing gratitude for representation, even wealthy white climbers acknowledging their own blind spots and privilege. And in the back of the room, unnoticed until the crowd thinned, stood Marcus Wellington. He'd flown in from Seattle, had sat through Tommy's entire presentation, had heard himself described not as a monster, but as a human being who'd made terrible choices and was working to make better ones. They spoke briefly, awkwardly, 2 men whose lives had intersected in trauma and transformation. Marcus looked different, older, softer somehow, with less of that aggressive confidence and more genuine humility. "I heard you were speaking," Marcus said. "I wanted to hear it from you directly, wanted to make sure you weren't pulling punches on my account." "I told the truth," Tommy said. "That's all I know how to do. I know, that's what makes you different." Marcus paused, seeming to gather courage. "I'm getting married again, to someone I knew in college, before I became the person you met. She's helping me remember who I wanted to be. We're expecting a daughter. I think about what kind of father I want to be, what kind of man I want her to know. Your example, Tommy, it haunts me in the best possible way. When I'm tempted to take shortcuts, to use my privilege destructively, I think about you choosing to save me. I think about what that mercy cost you and what it gave me. I'm trying every day to be worthy of that gift." Tommy didn't know what to say. Forgiveness wasn't a switch he could flip, and trust was something rebuilt slowly, but he could acknowledge growth when he saw it. "Your daughter's lucky," he finally said. "Most people never learn these lessons. Most people go through life never questioning whether they might be the problem. You did the hard work of changing. That matters." They shook hands, not as friends, but as 2 men who'd survived something profound together. Then Marcus left, and Tommy was surrounded again by people wanting to talk, to share their own stories, to thank him for his courage. But the moment Tommy would remember most came later that evening, when a young native teenager approached him nervously. She was maybe 16, wearing a conference volunteer shirt that was too big for her thin frame. "Mr. Naknek," she said quietly. "I'm Yupik, from a village near Bethel. I want to be a climbing guide, but everyone says I should be more realistic, that girls like me don't do that kind of work. Your story, it made me think maybe they're wrong. Maybe I can do it too." Tommy looked at her eager face, saw himself at that age, full of dreams and surrounded by people who didn't believe in them. He thought about his father, about his grandmother, about every person who'd ever been told they weren't good enough. "What's your name?" he asked. Sarah Ungat." "Well, Sarah Ungat, here's what I know. The mountain doesn't care who your parents are, or how much money you have, or what anyone else thinks you should do. It only cares about your skill, your judgment, and your respect. Everything else is noise. You want to be a guide? Then learn everything you can, train harder than everyone else, and never let anyone convince you that your dreams are too big. You understand?" She nodded, tears in her eyes. "And Sarah, when you make it, and you will, remember where you came from. Remember the people who believed in you and the people who didn't. Then be the guide who makes space for the next Sarah, the next kid who's told they're not good enough. That's how we change things, one person at a time, one choice at a time, one act of believing in someone when the world doesn't." 5 years later, Tommy received a photo in the mail. It showed a young woman standing on a summit, her face radiant with achievement, her gear professional and well-maintained. The note attached read, "Mr. Naknek, I made it. Just completed my first solo summit of Denali. Thank you for believing in me when no one else did. I'm starting a guiding service specifically for indigenous youth. Want to teach them what you taught me, that we belong on these mountains, that expertise comes in many forms, that our perspectives matter. Will you come speak to my first group of trainees? With gratitude and respect, Sarah Ungat, licensed mountain guide." Tommy showed the photo to his grandmother, now 90 and still sharp as ever. She studied it with satisfaction. "This is the real justice," she said in Denaina. "Not revenge, not punishment. This, helping someone else climb higher than you did. Your father would be proud." And in the end, that was the story's real conclusion. Not Marcus Wellington's comeuppance, though that had happened. Not Tommy's vindication, though that had come too. The real story was about how one person's choice to act with integrity could ripple outward, creating possibilities for people who'd never met, transforming systems that seemed immutable, proving that strength came not from dominating others, but from lifting them up. Tommy Naknek continued running the base camp lodge, continued guiding carefully selected clients up Denali, continued training the next generation of indigenous guides. He never got rich, never became famous beyond the small circle of people who knew what really mattered. But he built a legacy that would outlast any amount of money or prestige. A legacy of dignity, of mercy, of proving that how you treat people when you have power over them reveals who you really are. Marcus Wellington continued his own journey of transformation, using his wealth now to create opportunities rather than obstacles, funding programs that helped working-class kids access outdoor recreation, speaking honestly about his own failures and what they'd taught him. He never climbed Denali again. Some lessons didn't need repeating, but he found other mountains to test himself against, always with proper preparation, always with respect, always remembering that the mountain that had almost killed him had actually saved his life. And somewhere in Alaska, a brown bear continued living at impossible elevations, adapting and surviving, following its own instincts without judgment or malice. Just another creature doing what it needed to do to survive in a harsh and beautiful world. The moral of this story isn't simple, because life isn't simple. It's not just about bullies getting what they deserve, though sometimes they do. It's not just about victims finding justice, though sometimes they do that too. It's about the complicated, messy, difficult work of being human, of choosing mercy when vengeance would be easier, of insisting on accountability while creating space for growth, of understanding that people contain multitudes and that today's villain might become tomorrow's advocate for change. If you take nothing else from Tommy Naknek's story, take this. True strength isn't measured by how many people you can dominate, but by how many you can lift up. True courage isn't attacking those weaker than you, but defending them. True power comes not from money or status, but from integrity that can't be bought or sold. And true justice isn't just about consequences for wrongdoing. It's about creating a world where fewer people become Marcus Wellington in the first place, where more people become Tommy Naknek, where the next generation looks at mountains and sees possibility instead of barriers. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Comment below about a time you chose mercy over revenge, or a time someone chose mercy for you. Like and subscribe to hear more stories about real courage, real strength, and the transformative power of doing the right thing, even when it costs you everything. Because in the end, the mountain keeps its own score, and the only summit that truly matters is becoming the kind of person who makes the world better by moving through it. The base camp lodge still stands in Talkeetna, its wooden beams weathered by decades of Alaska storms, its walls decorated with photos of climbers who respected the mountain enough to survive it. Tommy Naknek still makes coffee at dawn for climbers checking weather reports. His grandmother's beadwork still hangs in places of honor. His father's journal sits behind the counter, continued now by Tommy's own careful notes. And sometimes, late at night when the lodge is quiet and the northern lights paint impossible colors across the sky, Tommy thinks about that moment on the mountain. The moment when he had to choose between the easy path and the right path, between letting nature exact revenge and proving that humans could be better than their basest instincts. He chose correctly, not because it felt good, it didn't, not because it was easy, it wasn't, but because in that moment, on that mountain, with a man who tried to destroy him, lying helpless in the snow, Tommy Naknek proved that the measure of a person isn't how they treat those who can help them, but how they treat those who can't stop them. That's justice. That's mercy. That's humanity at its best. And that's a story worth telling, worth sharing, worth remembering every time we face our own mountains and must choose what kind of people we want to be when tested by circumstance and consequence. The end of one story is always the beginning of another. Tommy's story continues every day, in every person he trains, in every climber he helps prepare for the mountain. In every moment, he chooses integrity over expedience. Marcus's story continues too, in his attempts at redemption, in the programs he funds, in the honesty with which he owns his past mistakes. And somewhere up there, 13,000 feet high in the thin air of the Alaska Range, a brown bear continues its improbable existence, a reminder that nature doesn't follow human rules, that survival sometimes means being exactly where you're not supposed to be, that the wilderness has its own wisdom, that no amount of money or arrogance can override. These stories intersect and diverge, create ripples that spread farther than anyone could predict, prove that single moments of choice can define everything that follows. What will your moment be when faced with power over someone who's wronged you? What will you choose? That's the question Tommy Naknek asks us all, and the answer we give reveals not just who we are, but who we're capable of becoming. The screaming started at 2:47 a.m., and Michael Chen would never forget that sound for the rest of his life, because it wasn't human screaming, but something worse. Something primal that came from recognizing your own flesh being torn and consumed while you were still conscious enough to understand what was happening. The October darkness of the Ontario wilderness pressed against their camp like a physical weight, and somewhere in that darkness, Warren Ashford III was learning that money and influence meant absolutely nothing to a 300-pound black bear that had decided these soft pink creatures in the clearing were tonight's menu. Blood splattered across the frost-covered ground in patterns that looked black under the pale moonlight, and Michael could hear Warren's expensive watch scraping against tree bark as he tried uselessly to climb with hands that had never done real manual labor in their entire privileged life. The bear's huffing breath created steam clouds in the freezing air, and its claws made sounds like knives being sharpened as they scraped against the maple tree where David Rodriguez hung 15 feet up with tears streaming down his face and his childhood rosary clutched in one fist. What these arrogant men hadn't understood when they'd planned this fishing trip 6 months ago was that cruelty has a way of circling back like a predator on a blood trail, and sometimes justice wears fur and weighs as much as a compact car. But none of them knew yet that Warren's decision to hang their salmon catch directly next to the tents would bring death to this clearing, or that his 3 days of constant belittling and psychological torture would mean Michael was the only one calm enough to think clearly when the attack came. Subscribe now to witness how one weekend in the Canadian wilderness would destroy 2 lives, transform 2 others, and prove that sometimes karma doesn't wait for courtrooms and lawyers, but arrives on 4 legs with teeth designed to crack bone. But let's rewind to where it all began. 72 hours earlier, on a Thursday afternoon in Toronto, when Michael Chen received a phone call he should have refused. Michael had been stocking shelves at Wong's Family Grocery on Spadina Avenue when his phone buzzed in his back pocket, and he almost didn't answer because the number wasn't saved in his contacts. and he'd learned that unknown numbers usually meant bill collectors or people trying to sell him things he couldn't afford. His fingers were stiff from lifting boxes of canned goods all morning, and his lower back ached from the herniated disc he'd gotten 2 years ago when he'd worked double shifts at the warehouse to help pay for his mother's medication after the stroke. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead and cast that particular shade of greenish-white that made everyone look slightly sick, and Michael had been thinking about how he needed to pick up extra shifts before rent came due when curiosity got the better of him and he swiped to answer. Warren Ashford's voice came through the speaker with that particular tone wealthy people use when they're asking for something, but phrasing it like they're doing you a favor. Smooth and confident, and somehow making you feel like you should be grateful just to be included in the conversation. He wanted Michael to join him and 2 other guys from Lakefield Wealth Management for a fishing trip up to Algonquin Provincial Park. 4 days in the wilderness, staying at some private cabin that Warren's family owned on the edge of Smoke Lake. Michael's first instinct was to decline because he'd worked with Warren briefly 3 years ago at a financial services firm where Michael had lasted exactly 4 months before being let go in what they'd called restructuring. But what everyone knew was the company clearing out the diversity hires who weren't from the right families or the right schools. Warren had been one of those golden boys who got promoted after 6 months despite barely understanding basic portfolio theory. The kind of guy who showed up hungover on Mondays talking about his weekend at the cottage, while Michael had been taking the subway at 5 a.m. to get to work early and study for his CFA exam during lunch breaks that he took at his desk, eating sandwiches he'd made at home because the downtown lunch spots cost what his mother spent on groceries for a week. But Warren was using his friendly voice on the phone and explaining that David Rodriguez and Tommy Brennan were coming, and they needed a 4th person because Tommy's brother had canceled last minute. And Warren remembered that Michael was outdoorsy, and hadn't they gotten along pretty well back in the day? The thing was, they hadn't gotten along at all, and Michael suspected Warren knew this perfectly well. But Michael also knew how this game worked. When someone from Warren's world extended an invitation, you were supposed to feel honored. And if you declined, you'd be marked as difficult or antisocial or not a team player. All those coded phrases that followed you around in professional circles that were smaller and more interconnected than anyone wanted to admit. Michael's father had been a Marine who'd served 2 tours in Vietnam before coming to Canada in the early 70s, and he'd taught Michael about choosing battles carefully and understanding when tactical retreat was smarter than direct confrontation. So Michael heard himself saying yes, even though his gut was telling him this was a mistake. Heard himself agreeing to take time off from the grocery store, even though Mr. Wong would be annoyed and might reduce his hours when he got back. Heard himself committing to spending 4 days in the wilderness with men who'd never once invited him anywhere during all those months they'd worked together when it might have actually helped his career. After hanging up, Michael stood in the canned goods aisle, holding a box of tomato sauce and feeling that familiar weight in his chest that came from knowing you'd just agreed to something that would cost you more than money. The grocery store was quiet, except for Mrs. Kowalski examining apples in the produce section, with the intense focus she brought to everything since her husband had died, and she'd started coming in 3 times a day just to have someone to talk to. Michael's phone buzzed again with a text from Warren containing a packing list that included items like premium insulated boots and high-end thermal layers and quality fishing gear that Michael definitely didn't own and couldn't afford to buy. He thought about texting back to explain that he'd need to borrow or improvise, but decided against it because admitting you couldn't afford the right equipment was another one of those class markers that people like Warren pretended not to notice while absolutely judging you for it. Instead, Michael mentally inventoried what he had in the storage unit where he kept his camping gear from back when he'd had time and energy for weekend trips to Killarney or the Bruce Peninsula. His father's old Marine Corps sleeping bag that still smelled faintly of mothballs and canvas. The sturdy but unfashionable backpack he'd bought at a surplus store, the reliable Coleman stove that had none of the sleek design of modern camping equipment, but worked perfectly fine if you knew how to maintain it properly. Michael had learned outdoor skills from his father, starting when he was 7 years old, and they'd done those weekend camping trips that were really excuses for his dad to teach him survival skills and discipline and how to stay calm when things went wrong. His father had died 4 years ago from complications related to Agent Orange exposure, and Michael still caught himself reaching for the phone to call him when something difficult happened. Still heard his father's voice in his head, saying that a man's character showed clearest when he was cold and hungry and scared, but still had to make decisions that affected other people. Thursday evening, Michael took 2 buses to reach the small apartment in Scarborough, where he lived with his mother in a building that had been nice 30 years ago, but now had cracked tiles in the lobby and an elevator that worked maybe 70% of the time. His mother was watching television with the volume turned up loud because her hearing had gotten worse since the stroke, and she refused to admit she needed hearing aids because they cost money that should go toward Michael's future. She looked up when he came in, and her face did that thing where she tried to hide her disappointment that he was still working retail at 28, when she'd sacrificed everything to make sure he got a university education. Michael heated up leftover stir-fry and told her about the fishing trip while carefully editing out his concerns because she worried about him enough already, and he'd learned to keep his struggles private. She insisted he take the emergency cash she kept in an envelope under her mattress, and he insisted he didn't need it, and they did the familiar dance of her trying to help, and him trying to be independent until finally he accepted $50 just to make her feel better. Later that night, Michael lay in his narrow bed in the room that had been his since they'd moved to this apartment when he was 14, and he stared at the ceiling and wondered what Warren Ashford really wanted from him, because men like Warren never did anything without a reason. Friday morning, Michael requested Thursday through Monday off from Mr. Wong, who looked at the schedule and sighed the deep sigh of a man who'd owned this grocery store for 32 years and had seen countless employees come and go. Mr. Wong was in his 60s, with silver hair that he combed straight back and hands that showed decades of hard work, and he'd been kind to Michael in that gruff way of men who expressed care through actions rather than words. He approved the time off, but mentioned that business had been slow lately, and he might need to cut hours across the board after the holidays. Michael thanked him and spent the rest of his shift restocking and cleaning, and trying not to calculate how many hours he'd lose, or how that would affect the rent that was already stretching his budget to the breaking point. During his lunch break, Michael walked to the surplus store on College Street, where they sold military gear and camping equipment at prices that people who shopped at the boutique outdoor stores would have found laughable. The owner was a Vietnam veteran named Frank, who'd served with Michael's father, and who always gave Michael a discount without making it seem like charity. Frank helped him pick out thermal underlayers, and showed him how to properly waterproof his old boots, and gave him advice about dealing with wildlife that included the memorable phrase, "Bears are like rich people, they go where the easy food is, and they don't give a damn about your feelings." Saturday and Sunday passed in the usual rhythm of work and taking care of his mother and trying to study for the CFA exam that he kept postponing because exhaustion made it hard to focus on complex financial theory when his brain was tired from physical labor. Sunday evening, Michael packed his backpack carefully, using the military precision his father had taught him, where everything had its place and purpose. He included the marine knife his father had carried in Vietnam, not because he expected to need it, but because having it made him feel connected to the man who taught him that being tough meant staying calm, and that real strength meant protecting others rather than dominating them. Monday morning, Michael double-checked that his mother had enough food and her medications organized in the pill container, and he kissed her forehead and ignored the worry in her eyes. He took the subway to Union Station, where he was supposed to meet the others at 9 a.m., and he arrived 15 minutes early because his father had taught him that being on time was a sign of respect, and being late was a way of saying your time mattered more than other people's time. Warren Ashford arrived at 9:07 a.m., driving a black Range Rover that probably cost more than Michael would earn in 3 years, and he didn't apologize for being late, but acted like 7 minutes was nothing. Wasn't even really late at all when you thought about it. Warren looked exactly like Michael remembered, tall and athletic, with sandy blonde hair styled in that effortless way that probably required expensive products and regular salon visits, wearing outdoor gear that had clearly never seen actual wilderness use, everything color coordinated, and bearing subtle designer logos that people in the know would recognize. He greeted Michael with a firm handshake and a smile that looked genuine unless you paid attention to his eyes, which were doing calculations, measuring and assessing like Michael was a stock he was considering whether to buy or short. David Rodriguez climbed out of the passenger seat, and he at least had the decency to look slightly embarrassed as he shook Michael's hand. David was shorter and stockier, with dark hair and nervous energy, and Michael remembered him as someone who'd always been polite enough, but who'd never spoken up when Warren made his casual racist jokes or his comments about people who hadn't gone to the right schools. Tommy Brennan emerged from the back seat all muscle and confidence, a former college hockey player who'd gone into wealth management because his father had played golf with the right people. Tommy had that particular brand of aggressive friendliness that came from never being told no, the kind of guy who thought everything was a competition and who needed to win even the smallest interactions. They loaded Michael's gear into the back of the Range Rover, and Warren made a joke about Michael's backpack looking like it belonged in a museum, and everyone laughed except Michael, who just smiled politely, because what else could you do? The drive north took 4 hours, with Warren driving fast and playing music loud and telling stories about recent deals he'd closed, while Tommy provided commentary and David occasionally interjected, and Michael mostly stayed quiet in the back seat watching the suburbs give way to small towns and then to forest. Warren had brought an expensive cooler full of steaks and beer and fresh vegetables, and Tommy kept talking about the salmon fishing and how they were going to eat like kings. They stopped for gas in Huntsville, and Warren paid with a platinum credit card and bought energy drinks for everyone, and didn't notice or care when Michael quietly paid for his own because he didn't want to be in Warren's debt. The last hour of the drive took them deeper into Algonquin on increasingly rough roads, until finally they turned onto a private drive marked with a sign that said, "Ashford Property, no trespassing," in letters that looked professionally made and expensive. The cabin turned out to be less of a cabin and more of a luxury lodge, with a stone fireplace and a full kitchen and bedrooms with actual beds, and Michael felt that familiar discomfort of being in a space that was designed to show off wealth, where every detail was carefully chosen to signal that the owner had money to spare. They unloaded the Range Rover in the late afternoon light that filtered through the pine trees and made everything look golden and peaceful. Warren immediately started organizing things in that take-charge way of men who were used to other people following their directions. And Tommy jumped right in to help while David moved more slowly, and Michael just found a corner to stow his gear and stay out of the way. The plan was to settle in today, fish Tuesday and Wednesday, pack up Thursday morning, and be back in Toronto by Thursday evening. Warren explained that his family had owned this property for 30 years, and his grandfather had built the original cabin, and his father had expanded it, and someday, Warren would inherit it and bring his own kids here. The property included 100 acres of forest and shoreline on Smoke Lake, and Warren talked about it with the casual possessiveness of someone who'd never had to worry about property taxes or maintenance costs or any of the unglamorous realities of ownership. They spent the evening grilling steaks that were probably $50 a pound and drinking beers that Warren had brought from some microbrewery that Michael had never heard of, and sitting around the fire pit while Warren and Tommy traded stories about their various adventures. David contributed occasionally, and Michael stayed mostly quiet because he'd learned that in these situations, it was better to listen and observe than to risk saying something that would mark him as an outsider. Warren asked Michael about what he'd been up to, and Michael gave the sanitized version about working retail while studying for his CFA, and Warren made sympathetic noises that didn't quite hide the judgment underneath. The implication that if Michael was still working retail at 28, then maybe he just didn't have what it took to make it in finance. The temperature dropped fast once the sun went down, and they moved inside to the lodge, where Warren started a fire in the massive stone fireplace, and Tommy found a bottle of whiskey that probably cost more than Michael's monthly rent. They played cards, and Warren won most hands, and seemed to take genuine pleasure in not just winning, but in making sure everyone knew he'd won. Around midnight, David announced he was going to bed, and Warren made a joke about David always being the first to tap out, and David just smiled tiredly and headed to one of the bedrooms. Tommy lasted another hour before admitting defeat and stumbling off to his room, leaving Michael and Warren alone by the dying fire. Warren poured himself another whiskey and offered one to Michael, who declined because he'd already had more than he was comfortable with and because he wanted to keep his wits sharp. Warren leaned back in his chair and looked at Michael with an expression that was harder to read in the firelight, and said something that Michael would replay in his mind many times over the next few days. Warren said he'd always wondered what happened to Michael after the layoffs, said he'd heard through the grapevine that Michael was working retail, and wanted to know if that was really true, or if Michael had something else lined up. Michael felt the trap in the question, but answered honestly, because lying would only make things worse. He explained about his mother's medical bills and the need to take any work he could find, and how he was still working toward his CFA, but it was taking longer than expected. Warren nodded and made understanding sounds, but his eyes had that calculating look again, and he said something about how tough it must be, how different their paths had been since leaving Lakefield Wealth Management, how he'd just been promoted to vice president, and was pulling down mid-six figures while Michael was stocking shelves. The words were sympathetic, but the tone was triumphant, and Michael felt something cold settle in his stomach as he recognized what this trip was really about. Warren hadn't invited him because they needed a fourth person, or because Warren remembered Michael being outdoorsy. Warren had invited him because Warren wanted an audience for his success, and he'd specifically chosen someone who'd fallen on hard times, so the contrast would be more satisfying. Michael had seen this dynamic before, with certain types of wealthy men who needed to prove their superiority, not just by succeeding, but by having witnesses to other people's failures. His father had warned him about men like this, had told him that some people were so empty inside that they could only feel big by making others feel small. Michael excused himself and went to the bedroom he'd been assigned, and lay on the comfortable mattress in the dark, listening to the forest sounds outside, and knowing that the next 3 days were going to be worse than he had anticipated. Tuesday morning, Michael woke at dawn out of habit and found Warren already up and making coffee in the expensive machine that probably cost more than Michael's monthly grocery budget. Warren was in a good mood, talking about the fishing and the weather forecast and how perfect conditions were going to be. Tommy emerged sleepy and grumpy, and David came out looking tired, like he hadn't slept well. They ate breakfast and packed the fishing gear and headed down to the dock, where Warren kept a boat that was probably worth $40,000 with all the electronics and upgrades. The morning fishing was actually pleasant in that way, that being on the water can quiet the noise in your head. The lake was calm, and the air was crisp, and for a few hours Michael could almost forget the social dynamics, and just focus on the repetitive motion of casting and reeling. Warren kept up a running commentary about his life and his achievements, and Tommy provided the appropriate reactions, while David mostly stayed quiet and Michael just focused on fishing. Around midday, they'd caught a decent amount of salmon, and Warren suggested they head back to clean the fish and have lunch. Back at the cabin, Warren directed the fish cleaning like he was managing a team meeting, and Michael ended up doing most of the actual work because he actually knew how to properly clean fish, while the others mostly watched and gave advice. Warren made a comment about Michael at least being good with his hands since the whole finance thing hadn't worked out, and Tommy laughed, and David looked uncomfortable, and Michael just kept cleaning fish and swallowing his anger. They grilled the salmon for lunch, and it was delicious. And Warren talked about how fresh fish was so much better than anything you could get in the city, and how his family had been fishing these waters for generations. In the afternoon, they went back out, and the fishing was good, and Warren caught a particularly large salmon that he made everyone take pictures of while he held it up like a trophy. Tommy caught a few decent ones, and David had trouble with his line, and Warren made jokes about David's coordination, and Michael caught several, but didn't make a big deal about it because he'd learned that with men like Warren, it was better to let them have the spotlight. That evening, they were cleaning the second batch of fish when Warren made a decision that would end up determining who lived and who died. He announced that, instead of storing the fish in the cabin's refrigerator, like Michael suggested, they should hang them on the outdoor cleaning station right next to where they were camping, because it would be more convenient in the morning. And besides, his family had been doing it this way for years, and had never had a problem with wildlife. Michael mentioned that it might attract bears, and Warren laughed and said there hadn't been a bear near this cabin in over a decade, and the nearest bear sightings had been miles away, and Michael was being paranoid. Tommy backed Warren up and said they'd hung fish before with no issues, and David didn't say anything, and Michael decided it wasn't worth pushing because he was a guest here and Warren clearly wasn't going to listen. They hung the salmon from hooks on the cleaning station, which was located about 20 feet from where they'd set up tents, because Warren had decided that real men should spend at least one night camping outside, instead of staying in the comfortable beds indoors. The tents were expensive ones with all the latest features, and Warren had proudly shown off the specifications earlier, like he was presenting a product pitch. Michael set up his tent, which was older and simpler, but perfectly functional, and he reinforced the stakes because his father had taught him that you always prepared for worse conditions than you expected. That evening, they made a campfire and cooked more salmon and drank more beer and told stories, and Warren steered the conversation toward a topic that Michael had been dreading. Warren started talking about their time at Lakefield Wealth Management and how funny it had been when the company did that big diversity push and hired all those people who didn't really fit the culture. Tommy laughed and said something about how affirmative action was basically racism against qualified people, and Warren agreed and said that merit should be the only thing that mattered, but these days, companies were more worried about optics than performance. David shifted uncomfortably, and Michael felt his jaw tighten, but he didn't say anything because he'd learned that arguing with men like this never changed their minds and only made you the target of more hostility. Warren kept going, talking about how they'd hired all these people from no-name schools and diverse backgrounds, and then had to let most of them go during restructuring because, surprise, surprise, they couldn't hack it at a real firm. Tommy added that it wasn't fair to people like them, who'd worked hard and gone to good schools, and earned their positions without any special treatment. Warren looked directly at Michael while saying this, and asked Michael what he thought, asked if Michael agreed that hiring should be based purely on merit. The question was a trap, and Michael knew it, but he also knew that staying silent would be interpreted as weakness. So he said carefully that he thought merit was important, but that defining merit narrowly based on what schools people attended or what families they came from probably meant missing out on talented people who hadn't had the same advantages. Warren's smile got tighter, and he said that sounded like something someone who couldn't compete would say. Tommy laughed and said that the marketplace decided who could compete, and if you couldn't make it, then that was on you. Warren added that he'd tried to help Michael back when they'd worked together, had given him advice, and tried to show him how things worked, but Michael had just seemed uncomfortable with the networking and the social aspects that were honestly just as important as the technical skills. Michael felt his father's voice in his head, telling him to stay calm and pick his battles, and he just nodded and said he appreciated the advice back then, and Warren seemed satisfied with this response and moved on to other topics. But the damage was done, and Michael could feel the dynamic shifting, could sense that Warren was getting bolder in his casual cruelty, because Michael wasn't fighting back, and silence was being interpreted as submission. David caught Michael's eye with a look that might have been sympathetic, but David didn't say anything to defend him, and Michael realized he was completely alone out here with three men who saw him as lesser and who weren't going to intervene no matter what happened. The temperature had dropped to near freezing, and they eventually retreated to their tents around 11 p.m. with plans to wake early for more fishing. Michael lay in his sleeping bag, listening to the forest sounds and thinking about his father, and wondering if he should have declined this invitation after all. He heard the others settling into their tents, heard Warren and Tommy talking and laughing about something, heard the wind picking up in the pine trees. He was just drifting off to sleep when he heard the first sound that didn't belong. It was a shuffling noise coming from the direction of the fish cleaning station, heavy and deliberate, and definitely not the wind. Michael's eyes snapped open, and he lay perfectly still, listening with the focused intensity his father had taught him during those camping trips, where every sound mattered. The shuffling continued, and then he heard something else, a huffing grunt that made his stomach drop because he recognized that sound from wildlife videos, and from his father's warnings about what to do if you ever encountered certain types of animals. Michael unzipped his sleeping bag slowly and quietly and reached for his boots and the marine knife that he'd placed within easy reach. The noise continued, and he could hear something large moving around the cleaning station, and he knew without seeing that a black bear had found their salmon and was currently investigating. He debated whether to alert the others, and decided he should check first to see if the bear would just take the fish and leave. Michael unzipped his tent as quietly as possible and peered out into the darkness. The moon was bright enough that he could see the massive dark shape near the cleaning station, could see it rising up on its hind legs to reach the hanging salmon, could estimate that it weighed at least 300 pounds, and was definitely not going to be scared off by shouting or banging pots. His father had taught him that black bears usually weren't aggressive toward humans, but that they were unpredictable and that you never wanted to be between a bear and its food, or surprise one in the dark. Michael was trying to decide what to do when he heard Warren's tent unzip and heard Warren's voice loud and annoyed saying, "What the hell is that noise?" The bear dropped to all fours and swung its massive head toward the sound, and Michael felt adrenaline spike through his system because this was about to get bad. Warren emerged from his tent wearing expensive thermal pajamas, and he apparently didn't see the bear at first, because he walked a few steps toward the cleaning station, saying something about checking on their fish. Michael hissed, "Warren, stop, there's a bear," but either Warren didn't hear him or didn't process the warning, because he kept walking, and then he did see the bear, and he stopped dead, and made a noise that was somewhere between a gasp and a yelp. The bear huffed and took 2 steps toward Warren, who stumbled backward and tripped over a tent rope, and fell hard on his back. The bear took another step forward, now definitely interested in this noisy creature that had startled it. Michael was out of his tent moving before he fully thought it through, because whatever else Warren was, he didn't deserve to be mauled by a bear because of his own stupidity. Michael grabbed a pot from near the fire pit and started banging it with his knife while moving to position himself between the bear and Warren. He shouted, "Hey bear, get out of here bear," in the firm, loud voice that wildlife experts recommended. The bear stopped and looked at this new threat, and for a few seconds that felt like hours, nothing happened, and Michael thought maybe the bear would decide this was too much trouble and would just leave. But then Tommy's tent exploded open, and Tommy emerged holding a flashlight and saying, "What the fuck is going on?" And he shone the light directly at the bear, which apparently was exactly the wrong thing to do, because the bear huffed aggressively and charged. Not at Tommy, but at the nearest target, which happened to be Warren, who was still on the ground, trying to scramble backward. Michael jumped forward and kicked at the bear's head, which was absolutely insane, but his body was running on pure instinct and training from all those hours his father had drilled him on protecting others. The kick connected with the bear's snout, and the bear shook its head and swiped at Michael with one massive paw that would have torn him open if he hadn't jumped back. Warren was screaming now and trying to crawl away, and the bear was deciding whether to pursue Warren or deal with Michael, who was making himself the bigger threat by yelling and advancing and banging the pot. David had emerged from his tent, and he had the sense to run for the cabin, shouting for them to follow him. Tommy was frozen with his flashlight, and Warren was still on the ground, and Michael knew they had maybe seconds before this turned lethal. He threw the pot at the bear's face and shouted, "Warren, move now!" Warren finally got his legs under him and ran toward the cabin, with the bear following him, and Michael grabbed Tommy's arm and yanked him into motion, and they all ran for the cabin, which suddenly seemed very far away. The bear was faster than any of them expected, and it was gaining on Warren, who was running in blind panic. They reached the cabin porch, and David was holding the door open, and Tommy made it through, and Michael made it through, and Warren was 5 feet from the door when the bear swiped at his legs and caught him. Warren went down hard on the porch, and the bear was on him instantly, and Warren started screaming in a way that would haunt Michael for the rest of his life. Michael grabbed a canoe paddle that was leaning against the cabin wall and swung it as hard as he could at the bear's head. The paddle cracked, and the bear turned from Warren and focused on Michael with eyes that reflected the porch light in an unsettling way. David was yelling for Michael to get inside, and Michael swung the broken paddle again and backed toward the door. The bear took a swipe at Michael's head, and he ducked and fell backward through the doorway. David slammed the door shut, and they could hear the bear huffing and scratching at the door, and Warren was still on the porch screaming. Tommy and David dragged Warren inside, through a side door and shut, and locked it, and they all stood there gasping and shaking while Warren sobbed and clutched at his leg, which was bleeding heavily where the bear's claws had torn through his expensive thermal pants and the flesh beneath. Michael found towels and pressed them against Warren's leg, while David called 911 on his cell phone, and Tommy stood there looking shocked. The bear circled the cabin for what felt like forever, but was probably 15 minutes, and then they heard it move back toward the fish cleaning station. Warren needed a hospital, and David was on the phone with emergency services, explaining the situation, while Tommy applied pressure to Warren's leg, and Michael checked the doors and windows to make sure everything was secure. The problem was that emergency services were at least 2 hours away, and Warren had lost a lot of blood and was going into shock. Michael had basic first aid training from his time trying to get certified as an EMT before financial pressures had forced him to abandon that path, and he took charge of stabilizing Warren while they waited for help. He elevated Warren's leg and applied a proper pressure bandage, and kept Warren conscious by making him talk about anything and everything. Warren was pale and shaking, and he kept saying he was sorry, and that he should have listened, and that Michael had saved his life. Tommy and David stayed by the windows, watching for the bear and reporting that it was still at the cleaning station eating the salmon they'd stupidly hung there. The 2 hours waiting for help were among the longest of Michael's life, because Warren kept drifting in and out of consciousness, and Michael had to keep him focused and awake. Warren started talking about his life in that way people do when they think they might die, talking about his father's expectations, and his constant need to prove himself, and how afraid he was of failing. Michael found himself feeling unexpected sympathy for this man who tormented him, because pain and fear had a way of stripping away all the social performance and revealing the scared human underneath. The Rangers finally arrived at dawn with EMTs, and they assessed Warren and decided he needed immediate evacuation to a hospital in Huntsville. The bear had left an hour earlier, taking the remains of the salmon with it. The Rangers checked the area and confirmed it was safe, and explained that hanging fish that close to camp had been incredibly stupid, and that they were lucky only one person had been injured. Warren was loaded into the rescue vehicle, and he grabbed Michael's hand before they took him away and said thank you in a way that seemed genuine and not performative. The Rangers told the rest of them they should pack up and leave the area immediately and not return until they'd consulted with wildlife management. Michael and David and Tommy packed the camp in exhausted silence and loaded the Range Rover and drove back to Toronto with Tommy at the wheel, because he was the only one steady enough to drive. They dropped Michael at Union Station around noon on Wednesday, and before he got out, David said quietly, "You saved his life, you know. We all would have frozen, but you knew what to do." Michael just nodded and grabbed his gear and walked to the subway because he needed to get home and shower and sleep and try to process what had happened. The next few days passed in a blur of police interviews and ranger debriefings, and Warren's father calling to thank Michael personally and offering to pay for anything Michael needed, which Michael politely declined because he didn't want to be in the Ashford family's debt. 2 weeks later, Michael was back at work stocking shelves at Wong's family grocery when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He answered and heard Warren's voice still a bit weak, but recovering well according to the doctors. Warren wanted to meet for coffee, and Michael's first instinct was to decline, but something in Warren's tone made him agree. They met at a Starbucks near the financial district, and Warren showed up on crutches, with his leg in a brace but otherwise looking healthy. They sat in a corner booth, and Warren said things he probably should have said years ago. He apologized for how he'd treated Michael during their time at Lakefield Wealth Management, and for inviting him on the trip just to feel superior, and for not listening when Michael had warned about the bears. Warren said that lying on that porch bleeding and thinking he was going to die had given him perspective on what mattered and what didn't. He said he'd been talking to his father about Michael, and they wanted to offer him something. Michael listened skeptically because he'd learned not to trust offers from wealthy men, but Warren explained that Ashford Investments was looking for an analyst position, and Warren had recommended Michael for it. The salary would be $80,000 to start with full benefits and opportunities for advancement based on performance. Warren said that Michael had more courage and intelligence and integrity in his little finger than Warren had in his whole body, and that he'd realized keeping score of who had more money or better credentials was a pathetic way to live your life. Michael wanted to believe this was genuine, but he'd also learned to be careful about accepting gifts that came with strings attached. He asked what Warren wanted in return, and Warren said honestly that he wanted to become someone worth respecting, that almost dying had shown him he'd been living like an asshole, and that he wanted to change, but didn't know how, and maybe having someone around who actually had principles would help. Michael thought about his mother and her medical bills and the rent that was always late, and the CFA exam he kept postponing. He thought about his father and what advice his father would give. His father would probably say that everyone deserves a chance at redemption, but that you judge people by their actions, not their words, and that time would tell if Warren was serious or just feeling temporarily grateful. Michael accepted the job offer with the understanding that he'd quit immediately if Warren reverted to being the person he'd been before. Warren agreed, and they shook hands, and Michael went home feeling cautiously hopeful that maybe something good could come from that nightmare in the wilderness. Over the next 6 months, Warren proved himself to be genuinely changed, or at least genuinely trying to change. He went to therapy and worked on his issues with his father, and stopped measuring his worth by how much he could dominate or diminish others. He became a decent friend to Michael and introduced him to people who helped his career and used his privilege to open doors that had been closed. Michael thrived at Ashford Investments and passed his CFA exam and got promoted to senior analyst within a year. He moved his mother into a better apartment and paid off her medical bills and started saving for the future. David Rodriguez reached out and apologized for not speaking up during the trip, and they became genuine friends who got coffee regularly and talked about their experiences growing up outside the privileged circles they now worked in. Tommy Brennan stayed in touch, and surprisingly also seemed to have learned something from the incident, becoming less aggressive and more thoughtful in his interactions. The bear that had attacked them was never found, despite rangers searching the area, and Michael preferred it that way because the bear had just been being a bear, doing what bears do when humans make stupid decisions about food storage. The real lesson hadn't been about wildlife management, but about human behavior and how close we all are to disaster when pride and cruelty override common sense, and how sometimes it takes a moment of absolute terror to show people what they're really made of inside. Michael never forgot that night, and the sound of Warren screaming, and the feeling of that massive paw swiping inches from his head. He never forgot the choice he'd made to run toward danger instead of away from it because someone needed help, even though that someone had treated him terribly. His father would have been proud of that choice, even if Michael sometimes wondered if he'd been stupid to risk his life for a man who'd belittled him for years. 3 years after the incident, Warren got engaged and asked Michael to be a groomsman, and Michael accepted because their friendship had become real and based on mutual respect rather than social obligation. At the wedding, Warren made a toast, and he told the abbreviated version of the story about the fishing trip and the bear attack, and how Michael had saved his life when he would have had every reason to just run and save himself. Warren said that Michael had taught him what real strength looked like, and that it wasn't about money or credentials or winning every interaction, but about having the courage to help others, even when they didn't deserve it, and about maintaining your integrity when circumstances would excuse you for abandoning it. The room applauded, and Michael felt uncomfortable with the attention, but also felt something settle in his chest, a sense that maybe all the struggles and difficulties had led somewhere meaningful after all. Michael's mother attended the wedding in a new dress that Michael had bought her, and she cried happy tears seeing her son respected and valued by people who would have once dismissed him. She pulled Michael aside during the reception and told him his father would have been so proud, and Michael had to excuse himself to the bathroom, where he cried quietly, thinking about his father and wishing he could share this moment with the man who taught him everything that mattered. The years continued, and Michael's career flourished, and he eventually became a partner at Ashford Investments and helped steer the firm toward more ethical practices and more diverse hiring. He mentored young analysts from backgrounds like his own and made sure they had the support and opportunities he'd had to fight for. Warren became CEO when his father retired and used his position to push for changes in how the finance industry thought about merit and access and opportunity. They stayed friends and went fishing together occasionally, though never back to that cabin in Algonquin, and always with proper food storage protocols. David Rodriguez started his own investment firm focused on underserved communities, and Michael helped him get it off the ground. Tommy Brennan left finance to become a teacher, which surprised everyone, but which he said was the first thing he'd done that actually felt meaningful. The bear that had changed all their lives remained somewhere in the Ontario wilderness, doing bear things, and probably having no idea of the ripple effects that one October night had created. Sometimes Michael still dreamed about that night and woke up with his heart pounding, but the dreams got less frequent as time passed, and he focused on building something better than what he'd left behind. What would you have done in Michael's position when the bear attacked, and you could have saved yourself by just running inside? Would you have risked your life for someone who'd treated you with contempt? These aren't easy questions, and there aren't perfect answers, but maybe that's the point. Courage isn't about always knowing the right thing to do. but about making choices in the moment based on your values, even when those values cost you something. Michael learned that night that you can't control how other people treat you, but you can control how you respond, and that maintaining your integrity, even in the face of cruelty and danger, is its own reward, even if it takes time for the external rewards to follow. Warren learned that privilege and money couldn't protect him from consequences, and that the person he dismissed as lesser was actually the strongest person in that clearing. The story spread through Toronto's finance community in various forms and became one of those legends that gets told to new hires about the importance of character and humility. Some details got exaggerated and some got lost, but the core remained. The story of a privileged man who learned too late about the dangers of arrogance, and a working-class immigrant son who showed that true strength meant protecting others, even at great cost to yourself. If this story made you think differently about strength and weakness, or about how we judge people based on surface markers rather than character, then please share it with others who might benefit from the message. Like and subscribe for more stories about real courage and the price of redemption, and the ways that crisis reveals who we really are when all the social performance gets stripped away. Remember that karma doesn't always arrive on four legs with claws and teeth, but that consequences eventually find people who build their lives on cruelty, and that the people you dismiss might be the ones who save your life when everything falls apart. The wilderness teaches harsh lessons about preparation and respect and humility, and sometimes those lessons have to be learned through pain before they sink in deep enough to change behavior. Michael Chen went on to live a good life, not because of what happened to him, but because of how he chose to respond to what happened, and because he never let other people's cruelty turn him into someone cruel himself. That's the real story, not the bear attack, but the choices we make about who we want to be when tested by circumstances that would excuse almost any response. Choose to be someone who runs toward people who need help, even when they don't deserve it, and even when it costs you something, and you'll sleep better at night than any amount of money or status could ever provide. I appreciate the detailed creative brief, but I need to respectfully decline this specific request. The premise you've provided appears to reference a real fatal incident involving an actual person who died in a bear attack. Creating entertainment content that fictionalizes or dramatizes a real person's death, especially one that involves turning their tragic final moments into a narrative with engagement hooks, calls to subscribe, and dramatic storytelling elements, would be disrespectful to the victim and their family. I can help you with alternatives. Fictional wildlife story. I could write a completely fictional narrative about a photographer's dangerous encounter with wildlife that doesn't reference any real incident, with a fictional protagonist and invented circumstances. Different justice narrative. I could write the 120,000 character bullying or justice story you've outlined, using a completely different premise that doesn't involve a real person's death, perhaps set in a school, workplace, or community setting. Educational wildlife content. I could create content about wildlife photography ethics, bear safety, or the risks of wildlife work without dramatizing real tragedies. Which direction would you prefer? I'm happy to create compelling long-form content for your channels, but I need to ensure we're working with fictional premises or handling real events with appropriate respect. The ice axe slipped from Marcus Wellington's trembling fingers, clattering against the granite face as his designer climbing gloves, $1,500 at the Seattle REI flagship,